In 2021, 12 clubs from 3 leagues in 7 different cities attempted to fundamentally alter the way that the world's most popular sport was played forever. Not only would this plan have effectively destroyed the most popular club competition on Earth in the Champions League, it also would have been a direct threat to the future of Europe's biggest and most popular domestic competitions. It was called the European Super League. And despite all the scary stuff I just said, the people in charge of it would tell you that it was the only way to save the sport. Rather than having to wait for an entire year to see Real Madrid play Liverpool in the Champions League final, teams like that would just play each other all the time. That would be the Nord, the best against the best. And if everything went according to plan, it would make an absolute ton of money. And for 3 whole days, that was the plan. It was the biggest story in the world, and had the people who organized it not made one crucial mistake, it might have stuck. And I'll tell you what that thing was in a bit, but for now, just know that not only was it the single thing that took down the Super League in a matter of days, but it's also currently threatening to destroy multiple leagues around the world in the exact same way. To a lot of people, the Super League kind of seemed like it came out of nowhere, at least in part because they announced it in the middle of the night on a Sunday. But a breakaway league that features the best teams in the world is not a new idea, and it certainly did not come from out of nowhere. Going all the way back to the 1950s, UEFA, who will become a bit of a protagonist in this story, advocated for a competition that would officially determine the champions of Europe. It was called, appropriately, the European Cup, and also appropriately, the first 5 editions of it were won by Real Madrid, who will also become a big part of the story later on. And that format was pretty simple. 16 teams, which eventually expanded into 32, all champions of their respective countries, drop into a big knockout competition. But there were also some potential problems with that. The main one was that the draw was random, which meant that while it was more likely that one of the winners from a bigger country would get matched up with a weaker team from a smaller country, it was also completely possible that they would get matched up against each other. For instance, in 1987, Diego Maradona's Napoli, fresh off of winning their club's first ever title in Italy, got Real Madrid in the first round. And this got the attention of people like Silvio Berlusconi, the owner of AC Milan, who was very freaked out by the idea of wasting a tie between 2 of the biggest teams in the tournament before that tournament had even really started. Wouldn't it be better for everyone if you had more games like that instead of less? He even went so far as to propose a new format for the tournament that he called the Super League, which promised more games, more money, and more, quote, economical and management guarantees for the success of its participants. The original format of this competition may have been flawed, but it had a kind of less is more approach that I think lent it a certain sort of gravitas. But to people like Silvio Berlusconi, less wasn't more. More was more, and that kind of thinking would dominate the football landscape for the next couple of decades. For instance, around 750 miles away in England, things were shifting in a similar direction. The English Football League had been the country's organizing body for soccer since the 1800s, including the First Division, but in the late 80s, some of its biggest clubs saw an opportunity to capitalize on the growing amount of TV money in the sport. It was also an opportunity to pull closer to some of the other leagues around Europe, including Serie A and La Liga. At that time, that's where the majority of the star power and money in the sport were, including a couple of very famous English exports like Gary Lineker and Trevor Francis. As part of my research into this story, I reached out to The Athletic's Nick Miller, who recently wrote a book called Who Owns Football, about a lot of these very same ideas. And as he tells it, while it may be kind of hard to imagine now, the reputation of English football around the world at that time was not in a great place.
There is this kind of nostalgic fascination with those first years of the Premier League in the 90s. And I think one of the main reasons was that it was really quite amateurish. There were these few years where there was loads of money, but but there was still sort of slightly amateurish attitude. Like, you know, it hadn't really occurred to many people, or it wasn't really viewed as a particularly bad thing that players would go out and, you know, drink 8 or 9 pints of beer on a Thursday when they got a game on a Saturday. It still then took a long time for that to kind of evolve into what we kind of see now. And kind of primarily because English football in the 1980s, you wouldn't dream of anyone, you know, thinking that they could make money out of it, because it was sort of, in wider society, it was kind of hated.
Quite how it got to that point is kind of its own story, but In order to try and kind of get some of that reputation back and to hopefully catch up with some of the other leagues around the world, the country's biggest clubs decided that they needed to take a big swing. And so they did. In 1992, all 22 of the teams in the first division withdrew from the Football League and formed their own breakaway competition. It was called the Premier League, and that effort was led first and foremost by a group of clubs called the Big Five, several of whom would also become big characters in the Super League story a couple of decades later, which is absolutely not a coincidence. The Premier League was and is a massive commercial success, but along with a few other changes being made in Europe around that time, it was also a step towards changing the sport in a way that couldn't be taken back. At some point, the players on the field stopped being the sole protagonists in all of this. The executives, people like Florentino Perez, Andrea Agnelli, or Nasser Al-Khelaifi, started becoming a much bigger part of the story, which is pretty weird if you think about it, but it does help explain how something like the Super League could happen. This is one of the main questions in Nick's book. How do we navigate a reality where owners are just as big of stars as the people they're employing?
The sort of central question that I was going to write about in the intro of the book, I think, that really kind of interested me is this idea that kind of everyone has a pretty good idea of what a bad football owner looks like. And there are, dozens of examples of those, but you can get very, very different definitions of what a good football club owner is.
Every ownership model in every sport has its benefits and drawbacks, but in trying to understand the formation of the Super League, there are a couple of important inflection points, starting with Roman Abramovich buying Chelsea in 2003.
This was the first example of this, or the first major example of someone coming from the outside of English football in this kind of model. There wasn't really a lot else to compare it to, and the closest people that you could compare it to were guys like a guy called Jack Walker, who I don't know if our American audience will know, but he made his money in steel, had nowhere near as much money as Abramovich, but he had enough money to essentially buy his local team, Blackburn Rovers, and buy enough great players for them to win the league title in 1995. So there was a sort of a loose model for this kind of, benevolent benefactor who didn't really want anything other than kind of, I don't know, maybe personal glory or satisfaction or whatever else. When they kind of span this story about Abramovich falling in love with the game, and he said he wanted to buy an English football club, and he nearly bought Tottenham, but changed his mind and bought Chelsea instead. It was all, people kind of did swallow it, really, I think.
Nick and I had a much broader conversation, mostly about the difference between ownership in the UK and the US, which I thought was super interesting. Do you want to watch the whole thing? It's available for free right now on our Patreon. But while Abramovich may not have meant for this to happen, in turning Chelsea into a powerhouse, he also kind of created a new archetype and a new standard for ownership in football. Stories like Jack Walker and Blackburn were a thing of the past. If you didn't want to get left behind, you might need to have one of those benevolent benefactors to help pay for everything. But eventually, if you have enough of those people around, having money doesn't directly equal success anymore. At that point, all it can guarantee you is survival, and once you get there, things start to look very different. If you take a quick look at the net worth of the ownership groups of clubs in the Premier League, you'll find that the median is somewhere around $5 billion. There's no point in looking at the average because the numbers at the top start to get absolutely stupid. But I mention that because having that kind of wealth in a league creates some interesting dynamics. Namely that once you get to that level of financial backing, the pool of potential ownership candidates becomes very small. Not many people or groups of people have anything close to that kind of money. That creates an environment where not only do teams have less control over who buys them, but they also have less and less incentive to turn anyone who could away. European football takes a lot of pride in being an open system where performance gets rewarded. But those financial realities mean that effectively, across the board, those leagues are getting more and more closed. Unless you're German, the boardrooms at Europe's top clubs are getting more homogeneous and increasingly more American. And I do think there is a chicken or the egg question to be asked here. Like, is the influx of Americans causing the leagues to become more of a closed shop? Or has the increase in financing and consolidation more generally made them more attractive to American investors? Either way, American owners tend to have a particular attitude towards how they run their teams, which I'm going to refer to as certainty brain. And I kind of get where they're coming from to a certain extent. If I invested a few $1 billion into something, I would probably also want some guarantees that the reward would be worth the risk. But despite what you might have heard, Americans are not the only ones who get affected by certainty brain. I know that because of proposals from people like Silvio Berlusconi, but also because a few years ago, something happened that threatened everyone's investment. And everyone, not just the Americans, absolutely lost their minds. In late February 2020, the Italian Federation announced that a handful of Serie A matches would be played behind closed doors because of the coronavirus outbreak. And one by one over the next few weeks, all of Europe's major leagues would either be postponed or shut down completely as the virus continued to spread. For people afflicted with certainty brain, this was the worst case scenario. If you're not playing matches, you aren't getting money from ticket revenue, or multi-billion-dollar TV contracts, or player trading or new sponsorship agreements, or really any of your typical revenue streams. The football would come back within a few months, but without fans, the cash it typically generated would not. Make no mistake about it, COVID-19 was a direct, existential level threat to clubs all around the world. The Super League clubs were in the best position by far to be able to endure something like that. And yet, their reaction to it was so strong that we're still talking about it more than 4 years later. Everything we've talked about up to this point, from UEFA starting the European Cup in the 1950s, to the formation of the Premier League, to the clubs reacting to COVID breaking out in 2020, all of it was aimed towards answering one simple question. How do we make our position more secure? The Super League was supposed to be the latest and most permanent solution to that. Rumors have been circulating for months that something like it was in the works, but on April 18, 2021, the 12-member clubs finally made their move. The Super League was set up as a 20-team tournament split into two groups, with each team playing a double round-robin group stage. That meant nearly 200 matches between the best teams in Europe every single year, all of which would generate ridiculous amounts of money for the teams involved. And when you say it like that, as a concept, sounds pretty cool. But to understand what it actually meant, I think it's helpful to look at what it would actually look like in practice. Let's think about a club like Tottenham. Spurs are a great example for this because their league performance is not super predictable. Believe me, I would know. They're kind of a bubble team. Some years they're in the Champions League pretty comfortably, but other years they're nowhere near it. And normally that's what makes the Premier League exciting. There might be like 10% of the league that can pretty much guarantee themselves a Champions League spot year over year, but outside of that, it's kind of a toss-up. If you're a well-run club that manages to catch lightning in a bottle for a little while, you can beat the odds and get yourself into those places, which is a very big deal because the money and prestige that the teams get for participating in that competition can be genuinely game-changing. But it works the other way too. If you miss out on the Champions League places for whatever reason, you're also missing out on tens of millions of dollars worth of extra revenue. Case in point, within a little over a year, Tottenham went from playing Liverpool in a Champions League final in Madrid to playing Lokomotiv Plovdiv on the road to qualify for the Europa League. Life comes at you fast. And while Tottenham made quite a few mistakes to get themselves in that position, the difference between point A and point B there, between finishing in the Champions League place or not, could be a single injury to one player or a bad refereeing decision. That's how tight the margins are at that level, and while that's exciting for fans, it's absolutely terrifying for owners. This is where this whole discussion really comes to a head. It is true that the Super League was ill-conceived, as well as hastily and sloppily rolled out, but that's not why it failed. It failed because the people at the top of the game perceived that risk as a liability, as a problem that needed to be solved. That's the mistake I mentioned earlier that took all of this down. In letting their certainty brains make their decisions for them, these people started to fundamentally misunderstand the actual appeal of their product. And once you make that choice, there's really no going back. From the outside, the flaws in the Super League format are super easy to see. For starters, I would argue that if every game is a banger, then none of them are bangers, actually. This is a fundamental principle in understanding both how your brain prioritizes things and how it processes reward. Think about going to a vending machine. Unless something crazy happens, if you put your money in a little slot, you know that you're going to get the thing you want. It's dependable and predictable, which in that case is great, but in a sports setting, it's actually not great at all. Sports have to carry jeopardy and risk to be interesting. If you take that away and just give and get the same reward no matter what happens, what's the point? The second miscalculation they made was similar, which was seeing the non-Super League matchups as sort of filler episodes in the stories of their leagues. Like, who would actually prefer watching Man City play Bournemouth or Sunderland instead of them playing Real Madrid or Juventus? Turns out quite a lot of people, actually. Those smaller games are what gives the big ones their meaning. That, and I think a lot of people were just upset by their favorite teams being treated like fodder for the big clubs. Either way, within 3 days, all 6 of the English clubs had withdrawn from the Super League with their tails between their legs, followed shortly by Atletico Madrid and the 2 Milan clubs. The only 3 that remained were the 2 main architects, Juventus and Real Madrid, and Barcelona, who were so crippled by debt at that point that they didn't have much choice. But that's an important thing to point out too, because whether it was COVID-19 or impending bankruptcy, everybody had their own reasons for hopping aboard the Super League train. And while solutions like the Super League are often dressed up as long-term fixes, more often than not, I think they're actually just permanent reactions to circumstances that are probably temporary. It's a kind of speculative bubble where one member of a group makes a move and then other people follow suit out of fear of being left behind. You're playing a cup final in Saudi Arabia? Well, we're going to play a league game in Miami. And if you don't want to miss out, better get with the program. These are the real lessons from the Super League. And to be truthful, they wouldn't freak me out nearly as much if leagues and sports all over the world weren't currently making the exact same mistakes. On my side of the Atlantic, we've had a ton of changes in college sports around the country, specifically around conference alignment, much of which was kicked off by Texas and Oklahoma moving to the SEC, coincidentally around the same time that Super League was happening. We've got an expanded playoff in college football now, with the reasoning behind it being, stop me if you've heard this before, increasing the number of meaningful games, making the sport more fair, and increasing participation in it across the sport. We've got leagues adding in-season tournaments and extra regular season games and bigger postseason formats, all in the name of things like competitive balance and opportunity. But I think we all know what's really happening here. It's not as cartoonishly villainous as the Super League, but it's the same instinct. More is more, and people make decisions based on the idea that what people really want is more of the good stuff. Who gets to decide what the good stuff is? Well, that's part of the problem. The Super League ended more than 4 years ago at the time of recording, but the reason that this topic is still relevant is because in a very real sense, the conversation is not over. Strictly speaking, I don't even think the Super League is technically dead, and there's about a 100% chance they'll try it again in some form, even though it went so poorly the last time. That's the bad news, but the good news is that there's probably still time to find the right balance before that happens. And we need to do that, because we've seen through leagues like the Premier League that once those decisions get made, you can't really put the toothpaste back in the tube. If we want sports that still feel earned, we need to create systems that protect context and risk, not try and get rid of them, as well as the small games that make the big ones mean something. Or else, what we have left won't really be sports at all. Hi everybody, my name is Will. This is my channel, Student of the Game, where we make video essays about sports psychology and culture. I've been trying to make this video for months and finally got the right balance to be able to put it in a form that made sense. I think it's a super interesting topic, and I would highly encourage you to go look at that talk that I did with Nick Miller, because there's a lot of context that I couldn't include in this video that honestly could have been like 45 minutes long. If you like the video, please do give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stuff like it. And put your recollections of the Super League in the comments below. We'll have more content like this coming out in the very near future, but for now, that's all I've got. I'm Will, and this is Student of the Game. See you next time.